Hello everybody, welcome back to Be Like Christ, and welcome back for another 5-minute Bible study. Today we're talking about Acts chapter 17, kind of one of the shorter chapters in the book of Acts, at least thus far. If you want this handout, you can download it. There's a link down in the description to our website. There's a bunch of free resources. And we've done all the other earlier chapters in Acts. You can grab the handouts for those, and there's a book coming, so watch out for that in the upcoming months. When do the events of Acts chapter 17 take place? Well, this is Paul, Silas, and Timothy's preaching journey, and this particular preaching journey happened sometime between 49 and 52 AD. As far as our characters, we've got 4 to highlight here. Paul, he's been traveling around the Mediterranean region planting churches. We've got Silas, who was originally from Jerusalem, and he joined Paul on this second missionary journey. Then Timothy. Timothy was a disciple who joined up with Paul and Silas. He was originally from Lystra or Derbe, one of those cities, and Paul asked him to join in this trip, and he agreed. Then finally, we have a character who's unique to this chapter, or a group of characters, the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Paul is going to meet them in the city of Athens. They are going to be curious about Paul's message, and they hear him out. Okay, what about our geography now? We'll take a look at the map above. That will be helpful. I've highlighted the major cities on that map. The 3 preachers left Philippi at the end of the last chapter, and they traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia before spending some time in Thessalonica. Now, they were run out of the city of Thessalonica, and they went to the south to the town of Berea. And then towards the end of the chapter, Paul leaves Berea and he goes down to Athens, and he's going to do some preaching there. Okay, and so now for our outline. Verses 1 through 9, there's a riot in Thessalonica. So Paul left Philippi, as we just mentioned, at the end of chapter 16, and he goes to Thessalonica to preach. And for 3 weeks, he discussed Jesus' death and resurrection with the people there. And there were many people who were persuaded by Paul's words, and they became believers. But some of the Jews got jealous. You know, those pesky Jews always following Paul around and giving him trouble. They became jealous, and they, quote, set the city in an uproar. They went to the house of a guy named Jason, where they thought Paul and Silas might be staying. They were looking for Paul and Silas, but they couldn't find them. And when they were unsuccessful, they dragged Jason and some of the other believers to the authorities, and they started accusing them of causing trouble in the city. So then in verses 10 through 15, Paul, Timothy, and Silas go to Berea. So because of the disturbance in Thessalonica, the disciples decided that they were going to send Paul away. They didn't think it was safe or productive for him to stay there. So Paul, Silas, and Timothy, they travel south to this place called Berea, and they found the people there much more open to the gospel message. The Bible describes them as, quote, they received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily. But soon, those pesky Jews, actually the Jews from Thessalonica, they learned that Paul was in Berea, and they came down to cause more trouble. And so the disciples sent Paul away to Athens, but Timothy and Silas remained in Berea working. And then the chapter concludes with Paul's visit to Athens, verses 16 through 33. So upon arriving in this very famous city, Paul was provoked to teach because he saw that the city was full of idols and idolatry. He taught in the synagogue and in the marketplace every day. And one day, these philosophers of the Epicureans and the Stoics, which you may know about from secular history, they brought Paul to a place called the Areopagus. And they wanted him to explain his message because they weren't super familiar with Jesus. Paul started preaching to them about the true God, the only living God who created everything, the God who stood in contrast to the fake gods of their imagination that they had built altars to and created all of these statues to represent. Paul told them that the true God couldn't be contained in something made by men's hands. And he described God as the Father of all mankind, who gives life and he sustains it. And being the offspring of such a great Father, Paul encouraged the Athenians not to think of God as, quote, like gold or silver or stone, like an image formed from the imagination of men. Paul spoke about the resurrection of the dead and how all men would appear before God for a judgment day. And when the Athenians heard about this resurrection of the dead, they had mixed response to it. Some of them mocked, and said, you dismissed Paul. And others of them were curious. And there were a few people who became believers, specifically mentioned one named Dionysius and one named Damaris. And so that's chapter 17. Let's talk about our application now. The way that we present the gospel can depend based on our audience. And it should depend based on our audience. I think we talked about this before. You remember back in Acts chapter 2, when Peter gets up on the day of Pentecost, he presents the work of Jesus to the people there, and he calls them to repentance, to baptism. He makes his case for Jesus as the Messiah by quoting a lot of Old Testament scriptures, because his audience was a bunch of Jews who would have been familiar with those Old Testament scriptures. But notice here, Paul doesn't do that because he's not talking to Jews. So he presents the gospel actually quoting Gentile poets in verse 28. So that shows us that we really need to consider our audience. When teaching others, take some time to try to understand their background, their culture, their sources of authority, the things that they value, and then ask God to help you use those facts to present the message of Jesus in an impactful way for your unique audience.